Hello again. Today's lecture is on arguments against dualism and implicitly then for materialism or physicalism, right? The claim that the mind is the brain. The author is Paul Churchland. He's here pictured with his wife, Pat Churchland. Both of them worked in the UCSD philosophy department. Pat is still listed as technically a professor here, although she's more or less retired. You'll see her around. Often in the cognitive science department, but they work together very tightly. Sometimes you can kind of sort of think of them as a unit. So this is authored by Paul, but you can be guaranteed that Pat will help Paul with thinking through these arguments. So he'll offer, I would count them as three arguments against dualism and for materialism. The first one uses as one of its premises Occam's razor. You may or may not have heard of this premise. It is one of the things that has sort of gotten outside of philosophy, but originated in medieval philosophy. William of Ockham, he was like a monk. Most philosophers at that time in the West, at least, were working in sort of monasteries, right, in the Catholic tradition. So he offered sort of a general criterion. If you want to decide like whether something exists, right? Do souls exist or not, right? Is the mind just a brain, or is there some other type of thing that's not physical, right? That's a mental substance. Like, how do we decide whether to like believe that something exists or not? A new type of thing. And Occam's razor's criterion, this in general says, let's be conservative about this stuff. Let's be a little conservative about the sorts of entities that we posit as existing, right? And one way of phrasing that is don't multiply entities beyond what is strictly necessary to explain the phenomena. And there's at least two ways to interpret that claim, right? So first of all, by entities, we just mean kinds of things that exist, right? Souls, for instance, right? Should we believe that souls exist or not? And then by phenomena, we mean things that happen, right? So there's certain things we'd like to explain, right? Our mental abilities, and sometimes, and this is not just in philosophy, right? Even in physics, right? Before anyone ever saw an atom or an electron, people posited, well, there's probably tiny little particles that make up the bigger things, right? So they posit them to explain phenomena they observe, and then sometimes eventually you do actually see it with your eyes, and then sometimes you never see it, right? So now we're on string theory. We will probably never observe a string, right? These are theoretical posits that help make sense of the phenomena we observe. So we're doing a similar thing here with the mind, right? Do we need to posit souls in order to explain the mind, or can we do it all with matter, right? Physical stuff. So two ways to interpret this Occam's razor. One is if you have two theories, right, that are both supposed to explain something like the mind, you just pick the theory with the smallest number of things in it, right? And maybe you should interpret that as the smallest number of kinds of things, right? So if it posits, right, matter and souls, and another one just says matter, then pick the one that just says matter, right? We don't need it. If you can get by without an extra kind of thing, then do that, right? That's one way, right? It's just sort of like fewer things is better. Another way to interpret it is to say it's not so much about like the sheer number of things or like types of things. It's more about the simplest, most elegant theory. And again, the attraction to simple, elegant theories exists outside of philosophy as well. I'm just going to physics as my sort of other example, but there's lots of other examples, right? For whatever reason, we seem to favor simplicity, right? The simpler theory is the better one, or the one we favor. Okay, so given this principle, right, Churchland's going to use that to argue that we shouldn't believe in souls. So, I mean, here's an example, sort of a toy sort of application of Occam's razor, right? A very simple theory, right? So suppose, in a simple phenomenon we need to explain, So suppose that I hear a thump in the night, right? I'm asleep and I'm awoken by a thump. And let's consider two theories that would explain the thump, right? One would be that my cat made that sound, right? My cat knocked. Another could be that a ghost made the sound, right? Maybe a ghost knocked the thing off the dresser, or the ghost just thumped the ground, or something like that. So how might we apply Occam's razor, right, to decide between these two theories of the thump, right, explaining the thump? Well, Ockham would say, let's take the first criterion, right? Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. For other reasons, right, my theory of the world already includes cats, right? So do I need to add ghosts to what we call my ontology, right? My theory of my catalog of things that exist in the world in order to explain the sound? Well, you might say no, right? I believe in cats. I have a cat. The cat would explain it. Let's stick with the cat theory, right? No reason to move to a theory that posits cats and ghosts as things existing in the world, right? So that's sort of the first way of interpreting it and of applying it. Another way might say, well, which theory is simpler, right, and more elegant? Well, again, right, we have physics, right, that exists, and the thump, cat, if you use the cat to explain the thump, it can all be explained, right, using physics. If I want to posit ghosts, well, now I need a bit more complicated theory. Not only do I have more things in the theory, right, that makes it more complicated on its own, but also I have to explain how ghosts interact with the physical world and create thumps and so on, right? None of that is clear. So by bringing in ghosts, right, not only am I adding more things to the world, but I'm also making my theory more complex, right? Now I need an account of ghost, interactions with the physical world, how do ghosts produce thumps. So Occam's razor does not say that you can never add things, right, to your ontology, that you can never have complex theories. It's just saying don't do it unless it's necessary, right? So think to yourself, right? Is there some sort of evidence, some sort of phenomenon that would like compel you to add ghosts to your theory of the world, right? Maybe if you literally see the ghost, right, making the bump, right, that might do it. If it turns out that the cat was in the other room, right, and there's nothing else that could plausibly explain it. So there are circumstances where you might have to add ghosts, right? But Occam's saying be conservative, only add stuff, only make your theory more complex when you absolutely need to. Okay, so let's see how Churchland applies this against dualism, right? So if you're a materialist, and sometimes another word for materialism is physicalism, we sometimes call you physicalist. We won't get into the details of how those might differ. Basically the same thing. If you're a materialist, you think everything in the world is matter, right? That's what exists. And you are committed to the existence of matter. You definitely have said, yeah, there is at least one type of thing in the world, and it's matter, right? So by Occam's razor, you shouldn't abandon that theory and add more things, right? Add souls unless you need to, right? So the question is, do we need to, right? We wouldn't need to if materialism can explain everything about minds, right? Now, as it happens, materialism cannot explain everything about minds, right? Really, the study of the mind is kind of in its infancy, and we're working on it, right? We've got cognitive science departments and neuroscience departments, right? And psychology departments and philosophy departments all working hard at it, and they're making progress. But there is a lot yet to do, right? So nobody in any of those departments would ever say, yeah, we've explained it all. We're done, right? I'm out of a job. They would all agree that it's not complete yet. So if you're going to be a materialist, right, and if you want to use Occam's razor to rule out souls, what you have to say is eventually we're going to be able to explain it all, right, using matter. We haven't yet, but we will be able to. We won't need to invoke souls. But this does leave a little opening for the dualist, right? They say, okay, so you admit that you can't explain everything, right? You're just saying that hopefully someday you will, right? So do materialists really have a good reason to say that eventually they will, right? they've apparently failed so far to explain everything, right? Um, well, yeah, I mean, Churchland says, yeah, we do have good reason to be optimistic, right? We will be able to explain the mind entirely in terms of materialist and dualist, right, stuff, right? So we've already gotten quite far. Some of the things we know, just a sort of handful of examples of things we know. We know how the sense organs take in information, right? We know how, right, light hits the retina, which is then translated into nerve impulses, which then go to the, right, through the LGN to the V1 to V2, V3, right? We can trace all of that. We know how these nerve cells work, right? And they fire electrochemical impulses, which then release neurotransmitters and then will cause other nerves to fire, which, right, essentially sort of transmit information, right, and electrochemically. We also know how these nerve firings control our bodily movements, and we know which parts of the brain are responsible for which parts of mental states. Here's a sort of like a, right, frontal lobe, problem solving, emotional traits, reasoning. Occipital lobe, that's the V1 that I was talking about. V2, that's vision, color perception, right? We have an area for language. The lower areas in the bottom are basic stuff like breathing, body temperature, digestion, and so on, right? So we know a lot. We're learning more every day, right? So Churchland thinks there is reason to be hopeful, even if we haven't explained it all, but we will be able to explain it all without having to invoke souls. But if the dualist is going to be stubborn and say, well, we'll see, right? Maybe, but maybe there's stuff, there might be some stuff. What about consciousness? I don't think you'll ever be able to explain consciousness, right? Do seem to be sort of in principle problems of explaining consciousness just because it's this totally sort of subjective first person experience. Like no one else can see into my own consciousness, right? So how could science, which is supposed to be this objective, right, third person, accessible to everyone sort of enterprise, how could it ever explain consciousness? There are sort of deep worries about that, right? And that might be a little wedge for the dualist to say, yeah, you're never going to explain everything. Okay, even so, Churchland says, let's look at you, dualists. How is your sort of research project, your research program progressing, right? How is the soul theory of mind doing, right? What have you explained? Not much, right? Can you tell me what a soul is made of? Not really. They can tell you what it isn't. It's not physical, right? Okay, so then what is it, right? How is the soul connected to the body? We've already seen with the debate between Descartes and Princess Elizabeth. There's not really an account of how non-physical souls interact with physical bodies. What are the parts of the soul? How do they work together, right? Churchland says there aren't really any good answers for any of these. Like souls are sort of a blank space waiting for a theory, right? Now here's this is my own comment, right? But there's actually a lot of what goes on in psychology departments and cognitive science departments doesn't make reference to brains per se, right? We do experiments, we observe behavior, and we posit like certain mental functions. Oh, you have a memory, you have a long-term memory, you have a short-term memory, and so on. We sort of always assume that those are instantiated in the brain, and we do have evidence that they're connected to the brain. But these sort of, what we'll call later when we get into functionalism, functional accounts of the brain, as in like, here's the part that feeds in the other part that feeds in the other part, sort of in an abstract diagram. That could be a theory of a soul, right? Maybe. I could see a paper where you argue for dualism saying, no, psychology is the theory of the soul, right? I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody, but that's just sort of my idea of like a way a dualist can maybe push back. But here's another way a dualist pushes back on, or at least a way that Churchland considers a dualist might push back, right? Might say, look, yeah, you learned a ton of things about the brain, and that is super great, right? But your mistake is in thinking that the brain is the mind. It's not the mind. It's the interface between the mind and the body, right? The soul is out here not in space, but it interacts with the brain, and then the brain controls the body, right? So all your study of the brain hasn't actually told you anything about the mind itself. You're just studying the switchboard, right? The interface. It gets right? Physical information, sends it off to the mind, and then it takes ideas from the mind and sends them off to the body. And so all the stuff that really is purely mind stuff, like reason, emotion, consciousness, the reason you haven't explained that yet is because it's not a brain thing, right? The brain is just communicating with the soul, right? So the dualist might say, you haven't even started to study the mind. You're just studying the switchboard. And then Churchland replies to this sort of imagined objection. And he says, well, first of all, some of those things that you said we have no hope of explaining, we actually have gotten pretty far at explaining, right? Mr. Dualist, or Miss Dualist, you said we can't explain reason. We kind of are, right? The artificial intelligence is like design machines, right? Artificial brains that can do mathematical calculations far better than humans, right? Isn't that a sort of prototypical reasoning ability, the ability to do math, logic, things like that? Computers are already better at us than chess, right? We have figured out reasoning, and we can build reasoning machines that far outpace humans, right? And then as far as emotion and consciousness, we haven't mastered it, but we're learning a lot every day. We know a ton of things about the neurochemical bases of depression and dreams. We can intervene, right, in people. We can sort of help them with their emotional problems, right, by intervening in their brains with certain chemicals, right? So we're learning a lot. We know a lot, actually, about this stuff, right? And so here now, I think, and maybe I could have flagged it better. Here starts but it's related. That's why I didn't. A new sort of argument. This is like the argument from the neural dependence of all known mental phenomena, which says, look, if you're right and the brain is just a switchboard, the mind, then why is that we now know exactly what part of the brain to damage to make it so you can't talk anymore or can't see anymore, right? When the brain is damaged, the mental abilities go away, right? Why is that? The mind is so independent of the brain. Now, of course, the dualist has a response, right? The dualist would say something like, well, yeah, when you damage the switchboard, the signal can't get through, right? So there's going to be a problem. But again, you didn't damage the mind, right? You just damaged the connection with the mind and the body. And then here, I think the materialist or Churchland might respond, that doesn't sound like how people describe the experience of having brain damage, right? They don't like experiences as like, oh, I know, like, say the language area is damaged, right? They don't say, oh, my mind is fine and I can totally compose exactly the sentence I want to say. It just won't come out my mouth, right? That's what it would have to be if it was a switchboard problem, right? Instead, it's the actual faculty that's damaged, right? They actually can't come up with the words, right? Or if the visual part is like they actually don't have the visual experience. It's not like they have the visual experiences in the mind somehow and then they just have trouble coming out, right? So again, you might call this the argument for the neural dependence of all known phenomena. It seems very clear that you damage the brain, you damage the mind, right? And if your mind is damaged, often we can find the part of the brain that's the problem. All right, and the third argument, call this the argument from evolutionary history, right? So Churchland points out that all species are sort of connected on an evolutionary tree, right? Life starts with these single-celled organisms. It builds up to jellyfish, plants, fish, snakes, little mammals, apes, and humans, right? It's this sort of continuous story of gradually increasing complexity. And part of that story is the gradual increasing complexity of the mind, right? You have very simple mental faculties in like, right, flatworms, and then it gets more complex. You get to rats and fish and then rats, right? And then apes. And they all do things you would call mental, right? So rats perceive, right? And they even do a little problem solving, but it's nowhere near as good as like what an ape can do or what a human can do. But it's gradual, right? Just like evolution is gradual. There's no sharp break where all of a sudden the soul, like this creature doesn't have a soul, this creature got a soul, and now it has a mind, and this one doesn't, right? On Descartes' view, if the mind is the soul, and certain creatures have souls and certain don't, you should see a sharp break there where like all of a sudden, whoa, this one has mental faculties, this one doesn't at all. that just isn't really what it looks like, right? It looks like this very gradual thing, much more in keeping with the mind is the brain, and so you get bigger brains, you get better minds, right? Not because somewhere a soul gets inserted. Okay, so that was essentially that's all of the Churchland article. The rest of this lecture is going to kind of fill the gap between the Churchland argument for materialism or physicalism and the last article in this week by Hilary Putnam, which is an argument for an account of the mind we call functionalism. So I've skipped over sort of an important historical chunk because I don't have really time for it. But so that you don't get confused when Putnam talks about it in his article, I'm doing about 5-6 slides here explaining what behaviorism is, right? So behaviorism sort of was born sort of separately in psychology, but also in philosophy of mind. I'm going to tell one story about how sort of it emerged in psychology, and then I'll also sort of connect it with philosophy. But at any rate, so we're like somewhere in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? And psychology, as it's practiced today, is sort of in its infancy. Some of the big names at the time were Wilhelm Wundt in Germany and William James in the U.S. and other people, Tishner and so on, right? At this time, much like Descartes, right, an important method they used for studying the mind was introspection, right? So that's what Descartes did. Descartes sort of observed what was going on in his own head, and he said, I'm thinking, right? I'm thinking, so I must exist, right? So what Descartes did is sort of a sample size of one, right? It's one person, and the researcher and the experimental subject are the same person, sort of, right? So Wundt and James and folks at this time were still using introspection, but right, the researchers and the subjects became different people, and the subjects became numerous people, right? So you could check up on a lot of different subjects and make sure that they're all sort of introspecting largely the same or find trends, right? So you're not just focusing on one person. For all we know, Descartes has a very weird mind, right? And the rest of us aren't. So it's a bit of an advance, but still, in principle, right, they're asking people, hey, observe your own experience and report what you see. So one sort of thing that they might do is present stimuli, say different lights, right, of different brightness or something like that, right? Very simple visual inputs, right? And they'd ask people to sort of rate, or maybe holding a series of different weights, right? And they'd ask people, as they gradually increase the brightness or the weight or whatever, right, the stimulus, ask people, when do you notice a difference? When do you notice that the light has become brighter, right? So they're asking them to report on their own experience, right, visual or otherwise. And this sort of approach produced results, right? So the thing I described eventually produced what we call Weber's law, which is then Fechner sort of modified it, so we sometimes call it the Weber-Fechner law. But it's a law of psychology that describes how perceived differences in intensity of a stimulus relate to the objective intensity of a stimulus, right? And it turns out that, like, when you go from only very dim light to sort of slightly brighter light, you notice the difference very easily, right? But if you're going from very bright to very, very bright, you don't notice, right, a similar change, right? A little tiny change when you're going from dim to less dim, people notice. If you're going from very bright to a little brighter, they don't notice that, right? And so that's turns out the relation, right, between the objective stimulus intensity and the subjective experience is a logarithmic relationship, and that is the equation that governs it. And you don't have to worry about that equation or anything, right? But this is just an example of sort of, again, a link between sort of what Descartes was doing and sort of what we do now, right? However, there were problems with this sort of introspective approach. that became more and more acute, and that led eventually to psychologists, at least temporarily, abandoning introspection and moving towards what we'll call behaviorism. What were the problems? Well, first of all, I mean, predictably, you got some variety in your responses, right? And a bit of variation is not really a problem. You sort of average over the distances, and you can still get a law that's more or less true for most people. And they also would do a lot of training, some of these labs, right? You would do practice like thousands and thousands of trials before they even considered your responses to be data, right? Because they wanted people that were accurately sort of. But even so, you had some sort of serious, like important differences that couldn't really be resolved by just averaging or by like doing better training. So one important issue that would seem to be just unresolvable by this introspective method was on the issue of whether there exists imageless thought. What I mean by imageless thought is like, can you have a thought that isn't accompanied like either by an inner voice, right? I think often when you're thinking, maybe you're sort of just saying stuff in your head, right? And you kind of hear your own little voice saying stuff in your head. Unless, of course, deaf people think differently. It's an interesting question, right? But like for those of us who speak, often we sort of speak to ourselves inside our head, and maybe that's what we call thinking. Or sometimes maybe you just sort of, imagine a picture or something like that. But the question was, is there thinking that isn't either of those things, right? Can I think apples are delicious without like imagining an apple or imagining, right, my voice saying that sentence or anything like that? Just a pure sort of empty, imageless thought that apples are delicious. And so some labs said, yeah, people report they can do this, right? And other labs said, no, people report they cannot. I don't think I can, right? If I'm thinking apples are delicious, I'm having some imagery going on, be it audio or video, something like that. But apparently some people say, yeah, I can do that. So that seemed unresolvable, right? It seemed we smack up against a limitation of introspection because everyone, again, you can't peer inside their heads to verify, right? And so it's hard to say without some more objective criteria. So this led to behaviorism, sort of frustration with these limitations of introspection. Right? Proponents of behaviorism thought introspection is like imprecise, it's not objective, right? You're just relying on people's reports of what they think they see in their head. So instead of doing that stuff, right, the trend became, I'm not going to ask you what's going on in your mind. I'm going to instead just observe your behavior, right? Given certain inputs, I'm going to observe the behavioral outputs, right? And I'll develop my psychological laws that way, right? The sort of the variables will be, again, an objective input and objective behavior, and I can formulate laws just using those two variables. I don't necessarily need variables representing whatever is going on inside your head. Now, there's variations on sort of how seriously they take this. We usually carve it up into three: methodological behaviorism, logical behaviorism, and ontological behaviorism. So methodological behaviorism is not really taking any stance on like whether there actually is something going on in your head, right? That's sort of mediating these objective inputs, right? Like food or water or electric shocks or whatever, and behavioral outputs like eating or drinking or running away. Maybe there's something going on inside, but the methodological behaviorist says, I can't study that. I can't peer inside your head. So the best way to do psychology is just to focus on the objective stuff. Right? Another sort of stronger form of behaviorism we call logical behaviorism. It's associated with this fellow here, Ludwig Wittgenstein, or at least it's inspired by some of the things he said. Often he says is fairly cryptic, and people take a lot of sort of draw a lot of conclusions from what he said, and it's not clear what he actually thought, but it's associated with him. So logical behaviorism is the claim that any sentence, it's a claim about language, right? It's a claim about sentences, and it says any sentence that features a mental state, like I'm in pain, right, or I'm experiencing the color red, it can always be, without any loss of meaning, translated into a sentence that's purely about objective inputs and behavior, right? So, according to logical behaviorism, if I say Nate is in pain, we can translate that into a sentence like Nate is disposed to cry out, display aversive behavior, and avoid, right, the painful stimulus in the future, or something like that. I should take out the word painful of the stimulus, right? Because we're trying to translate away the mental state terms of pain, right? So to say X is in pain, to say is X is disposed to cry out, X is disposed to wince, X is disposed to avoid the stimulus. Okay, right? That's fine, right? Believe it if you can, right? And then the next stage, that's sort of even more intense version of behaviorism, we call ontological behaviorism, which just outright claims. So it's not just a claim about how you should do psychology, like methodological. It's not a claim about how you translate certain types of sentences, like logical behaviorism. It's a claim about what exists, and the claim is there are no mental states. Mental states don't exist. There's only behavior, right? So pretty strong claim. If you find that to be an implausible claim, you're not alone, right? And behaviorism eventually died out somewhere around the 60s and 70s and was replaced by what is now probably the dominant form of psychology, which we call cognitive psychology. So cognitive psychology, it's not like a reversion totally to introspection, right? To the days of James and Wundt. We still use objective stimuli and we still observe behavior, right? Those are the primary variables still in any experiment. But we use those to infer, right, truths about what's going on inside the mind, right? So we do posit that there are some mental states, right, that mediate behaviors. So if I try to hand you a Snickers bar, and typically you would eat the Snickers bar, right, because you like Snickers, but this time you don't, right? I will posit that maybe in your head something's going on like, oh, I'm very full. Oh, if I eat too much sugar right now, I'll crash before class. Oh, right, I'm trying to cut down on calories or something like that, right? So we posit some sort of belief in your head, right, to make sense of basically how the fact that there are frequently different behaviors given the same input, right? Okay, so some of the stuff I study in my research involves something called representation-mediated taste aversion. So I'm just giving this as an example of cognitive psychology, right? Where here we're using rats, so rats can't necessarily report to us, right? Introspect and then report what's going on in their heads. So we only have objective inputs and behaviors, and nonetheless we infer what's going on in their minds, right? So in these sorts of experiments, what you do is you give a rat two different kinds of flavored sugar water, right? So maybe one flavor is mint and one flavor is berry. Sugar water, also we'll call them sucrose, I think, later, right? Same thing. Sugar water, sucrose. So they got the mint water, they got the berry water. They like them both, right? They like them both equally. And then what you do is you pair one of these or both of these stimuli with a tone or with different tones, right? Right. So you just play like a beep or a C sharp or something when they drink the water. So they come to associate the flavor with a certain sound, right? Then you put a nausea-inducing chemical in one of the flavors of sugar water, right? Now, we know independently, right, that when you pair something with nausea, it makes people hate it. It tastes bad to them. Maybe you've experienced that before. If you ever had food poisoning, this happened to me once, the restaurant Fuddruckers, right? I ate a Fuddruckers burger and I got very sick and I threw up and I couldn't even stand the idea of Fuddruckers, right? For like years, right? It'll really put you off a certain food. And it'll even, it turns out, particularly for these rats, it will like taste disgusting to them if it's made them sick before. Okay, so you do all these things. Now notice the tone has never been associated directly with the nausea. The tone is just associated with the flavor of the water, and the flavor of the water is paired with nausea. But after doing all that, all you have to do is play the tone, right, around totally plain water with no flavor, and the rats will drink it and act like it's disgusting. There are certain behaviors that show like this is disgusting, right? So what's going on? Well, we can infer that playing the tone has sort of produced a flavor hallucination, right? So we can infer what's going on, right, in their conscious experience, these rats, what's going on in their heads. The water tastes bad to them because of the association with the tone. Okay, so that's cognitive psychology, right? So now we've caught up to like the 1960s, 1970s, up until today. So when you read the Hillary Putnam article, he's writing back in the 60s, just as people were starting to turn sour on behaviorism, right? And he's going to be opposed to behaviorism, right? Also, pure physicalism. He's going to say physicalism can't work either, and he's going to give some convincing reasons why. But he's also not a dualist, right? So what he's going to offer is what we call functionalism, and it's a way to still be a sort of physicalist, right? You don't have to believe in souls, and yet it's going to hopefully work for solve some of the problems that he's going to point out with physicalism and with behaviorism. Okay, see you next time.